Okay, hello chess players. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Ruy Lopez, beginning with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, and we're going to be taking a look at something called the Tarrash variation of the Ruy Lopez. Basically, black is attacking this pawn on e4, and the normal strategy in this position is to just sort of castle kingside so that we can enable c3 and d4 and get a pawn duel in the middle of the board and get a slight edge. What the Tarrash variation does is it just sort of defends this pawn in a very beginner way. It just develops a piece and just says, okay, I'm going to defend this pawn. Anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on that notification icon. So I'm making a full opening survey video out of this, even though my original intention was I was just going to do like a light examination of it, which I did in a previous video, because I just didn't feel like there was a whole lot in these positions because they kind of feel like just a very slow version of the Ruy Lopez, and it just feels like you're not getting enough to declare that you have some sort of advantage. But after some discussions on the channel, I noticed that there was a little bit more in these positions than I thought, and of course there are top players that are willing to try this, and a big reason for that is because it is just so hard to get anything out of the main lines anymore because the main lines have been studied to absolute death. There is very little doubt that castles kingside, followed by the idea of eventually playing c3 and d4 and gaining that pawn duel in the middle of the board, is probably the best way to play chess. Unfortunately, it's just been played so much that a lot of these positions have been worked out to move 40, 50, and 60, and that brings us back to a move like knight c3, where, okay, even though we're getting a little bit less out of the position, even though the position is fundamentally going to be much slower for white, because you have to get this knight out of the way in order to play c3 and d4. So whether you get it out of the way by bringing the knight eventually to d5, or whether you get it out of the way with knight e2, knight g3, you have to get it out of the way in order to play c3, d4. So the fundamental plan of the Ruy Lopez is just going to end up being slower. But that being said, at least the positions are different than the main lines, and at least maybe you're going to get a chess game out of it. So anyway, so let's take a look at what we need to do here. So sort of the main moves that we looked at in the last video were, people can try bishop c5, and of course people can play bishop e7. Now, of these two, I'm actually more worried about bishop e7, believe it or not. And the reason I'm more concerned about bishop e7 is because if I play some natural move, like if I just castle, we would have b5, bishop b3, d6, and then after I play a3 to safeguard the bishop, they could play bishop g4, which appears to just completely equalize. This was played in Carlsen versus Kamar back in 2023, and the game did end in a draw. It continued h3, bishop f3, queen f3, knight d4, queen d1, knight b3, cb3, and as you can see, the position is really just totally equal. It's very hard to get anything out of this with white. White doesn't have the bishop pair. White has doubled pawns. It's after c5, which wasn't played in the game, the position really should just be completely equal once you play c5. Now, the game continued with castles, and then Carlsen played d4, and Carlsen can sort of claim that he has something here with the white pieces, but it really wasn't even enough even here. He just doesn't have enough left. So this ended in a draw in Carlsen versus Kamar, played back in 2023. So what are we going to do? Well, the move order seems like it really matters. Like bishop e7, it looks like you have to play d3. And this is actually one of the reasons why I think maybe if you want to play these slow ideas, I think maybe there's more to just playing d3, and I still feel that way. And I might end up doing a whole video just on d3, but I feel like d3 with the idea of the slow moving plan of eventually c3 and d4 with knight on b to d2 to f1 to g3, this is a little bit better than the Tarrash variation with knight c3, just because we're inherently going to end up keeping more material on the board. And if we get these positions that aren't totally booked out and we keep more material on the board, then we should have more winning chances in general. So I do feel like this is something worth exploring, but that's going to be probably a whole video on its own. So going back to knight c3, I think we have to, after bishop e7, I think we have to play d3. Now, again, I said there were two lines here. There's bishop e7. There's also, of course, the move bishop c5. I think that it's reasonable to assume that white has some sort of slight advantage after bishop takes c6, dc6, d3. And we're playing sort of an exchange variation Ruy Lopez where this bishop is actually a little misplaced on c5. And it's hard to prove that it's not, because, for example, let's say queen d6, h3, bishop e6, bishop e3, we get to trade off that bishop pair. This is what happened in Carlsen versus Anand and Wickensey back in 2019. And after a very, very, very long game, eventually Carlsen did go on to win. White has a very, very slight edge here because of the pawn structure, and once he gets rid of black's bishop pair, black doesn't have the bishop pair to compensate. He doesn't have much of a disadvantage. Black is just a hair worse. He should have enough to get a draw here, but white definitely can declare a slight edge at this point. So that's probably the way to go against bishop c5. We should probably just play this delayed exchange. We should probably just play bishop takes c6. But after knight c3, bishop e7, again, this is a big concern. It's a little bit harder to play this delayed exchange, like bishop takes c7, bc6, d3, because as you can see, we're not going to be picking up this bishop pair. So after knight d7, we just have an exchange Ruy Lopez where black definitely has the bishop pair in compensation for the pawns, and White can declare that he has some sort of slight advantage here. I have this game, Mamanjarov versus Oparin, which continued with h3, castles, knight e2, rook e8, g4, bishop b4 check, bishop d2, queen d2, where Mamanjarov had some kind of slight edge with the white pieces here. So, but of course, none of these moves are completely forced. And black doesn't have to go down that path, and of course white could probably go down a different path as well, like a different path other than g4. But needless to say, like right here, white should maybe have just a very, very slight edge because of the pawn structure, but on the whole, this position should just be like a normal exchange variation Ruy Lopez, where black has the bishop pair in compensation for the broken pawn structure. So the delayed exchange isn't spectacular. So what we need to do is we need to play this move order beginning with d3. And then we need to play this very tight, very specific move order. After b5, bishop b3, d6, we have to play a3. The point is we really need to be able to meet this move bishop to g4. When they play bishop g4, we don't want to have to play pawn to h3, bishop takes f3, queen f3, knight d4, where they pick up this bishop pair on b3. Now, in this case, after bishop g4, we should have the move bishop e3, which should end up being very slight edge white. The point being is, if now, for example, knight d4, we can simply capture that knight on d4, e takes d4, knight d5. c6, another way to go would be if they were to play knight d5, bishop d5 should be advantage white. Bishop d5, rook b8, h3, bishop f3, bishop c6, king f8, queen takes f3 is probably somewhere between slight edge to major advantage white. The king on f8 is very, very misplaced. So instead of that, we would have something like, instead of knight d5, we would have something like c6, which has actually been played before. I got this game, Ramirez versus Perdomo, played in Brazil back in 2014, which continued with knight takes e7. And then we had queen e7, h3, bishop f3, queen f3, and white had a slight edge here. It's bishop versus knight. White has the slightly better pawn structure. Another way that white can play it, at least according to the engine, is h3 is supposed to be totally acceptable. And then the idea is after bishop takes f3, we throw in, of course, this in-between check. We have to play knight takes f3. Bishop takes f6, queen f3 is supposed to be slight edge white. Basically preferring the opposite colored bishop approach, where the dark squared bishop just doesn't really have a great place to go, and the doubled pawns are actually hindering the dark squared bishop. So this should be slight edge white as well. So playing bishop e3 here should yield slight edge white after bishop to g4. So instead of bishop g4, we're going to have something like castles, and then we have a bunch of games here beginning with the move knight a5. Something that's interesting to note, and something that's a little bit of an annoyance here for me, is when you're approaching this middle game with the white pieces, it seems like the maneuver knight on c3 to d5 is almost obligatory. And this is a little bit of an annoyance because, like, I was looking at the theory and I was trying to figure out ways to actually play knight e2 to g3, followed by c3 and d4, so that I could keep the maximum amount of material on the board possible and basically still have winning chances. The issue is, and what all the top players are playing because the engine is spitting it out, is all the top players are playing something like knight a5. It's also possible to play like the immediate bishop e6, and it's kind of the same problem. Is when they play the immediate bishop e6, you have to make some sort of decision with this bishop. And you don't have time, like in the normal Ruy Lopez, you would have time to retreat this bishop to c2 because the pawn would already be on c3. But in this position, you don't have time to do that. So you basically have two choices. You can either, like take on e6, you can retreat to a2, or you have this third choice, you can play knight d5. And knight d5 ends up kind of being an obligatory move here because moves like bishop a2 are just terrible. Like, for example, bishop a2, knight a2, queen d7 would actually be slight edge black. The pawn structure is symmetrical, and white's losing a whole bunch of tempo, retreating bishops and retreating knights, and then, of course, having to bring them back. So you end up having to play knight d5 just to keep the initiative. And this is a little bit of an annoyance, but apparently the positions are still supposed to be slight edge white, even though this piece is getting exchanged. So, for example, knight d5, we would have knight d4, knight d4, ed4, and then we have this game of Ashir Lagrave versus Sanal played in 2022, and that game did not continue a4. That game continued knight takes f6, bishop f6. I have another game here that continued a4, but knight takes f6, bishop takes f6, bishop e6, fe6, queen g4, queen e8, f4 would be slight edge white, and the actual game of Vachir Lagrave versus Sanel did continue a4, and then we had knight takes d5, bishop d5, bishop d5, e takes d5, queen d7, and apparently white is doing okay here. So white has a little bit to play for here, even though the structure and everything looks kind of symmetrical. He continued with b3, and he's got options to develop the bishop this way, put pressure on d4. Of course, he's gaining some space on the queen side. White has some options to play for a win. I would recommend this other line, basically the computer line. Instead of a4, I would recommend just knight f6, bishop f6, bishop e6, fe6, queen g4, queen e8, f4 slight edge white. I think this is probably the proper path, and the path that Vachir Lagrave should have gone down. But as it was, Vachir Lagrave won the game anyway. Okay, he didn't have as much of an advantage as I would have liked, but oh well. So basically, knight d5 ends up being an obligatory move. If they play bishop e6, you have to play knight d5. Now, what all the top guys are doing is they're playing this move knight a5 first and gaining this tempo, and then after bishop to a2, they're playing bishop e6. So we're following a really heavy game here. We're following Carlsen versus Caruana, played in Toronto back in 2023, and that game continued with bishop to g5. And okay, so what's interesting is probably the best move here in this position is b4, according to the engine. So b4, and it's been played before. It's been played many times. So like, for example, b4, bishop takes a2, rook takes a2, knight c6. And then I have a game here that continued with bishop d2, but bishop d2 wasn't best. Probably best is something like bishop g5. And these positions should be slight edge white. So b4, this space gaining move, is probably a better way to go. Now, rewinding and taking a look at this other approach, instead we have bishop g5 in this Carlsen versus Caruana game, and that game continued with pawn to c5, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, knight d5, knight back to c6, pawn to c3, pawn to g6, pawn to b4, bishop to g7, queen d2, knight e7, knight takes e7, queen takes e7, bishop e6, queen e6, and the position is just completely equal. And that's the problem that we're going to run into with this line when we play everything out, is it just seems like when you're maneuvering with knight c3 to knight d5, too many pieces get exchanged, and it's very difficult to continue to play for a win once too many pieces come off the board. There's just not enough left in the position to play for a win. So this ended in a draw between Carlsen and Caruana. But again, all that being said, what I would recommend is just to play the computer improvement, play this move pawn to b4, allow bishop takes a2, rook takes a2, knight c6, and then play the move bishop g5, which is again an improvement on previously established games, and just kind of go down this path. So, I mean, I've got Other games here, I've got Abustra versus Cariana, and I've also got Carlsen versus Ding Liren. So we have this Carlsen versus Ding Liren game that continued bishop g5, and then we have bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, and then knight d5. We have pawn to a5, pawn to c4, knight e7, rook c2, knight takes d5, c takes d5, takes, rook to a4, queen d2, rook f a8, and then rook fc1. And as you can see, Carlsen is getting something out of this position. He's putting pressure on the c7 square. And again, this is Carlsen versus Ding Liren, played in St. Louis back in 2017. We have bishop to d8, pawn to h3, rook a1, rook takes a1, rook takes a1, rook c1, rook a4, d4, e takes d4, knight d4, bishop f6, knight to c6, queen c8, e5, d takes e5, d6, rook a8, knight takes e7, bishop e7, d takes e7, and Carlsen is winning here. This pawn is an advantage that cannot be stopped at this point with the pressure on d8 and c7 and the threat of queening, coupled with the fact that there is no weakness on the back rank for white, but there is for black. Black can get mated back here. White has this safety square. Ding Liren had to resign. So that was Carlsen versus Ding Liren, played in St. Louis back in 2017. So in summary, basically this move, this Tarrash variation, beginning with knight c3, is certainly a playable idea. I think it's totally fine. The only downside of it is a couple of pieces are just naturally going to get exchanged. The only real way to play the position, again, is to play this very specific move order after bishop e7, beginning with d3, b5, bishop b3, and then you have to play a3. And when you play this line, it's just absolutely inevitable. This knight is going to end up going to d5. And it's absolutely inevitable that you're going to end up with pieces getting exchanged. You're going to end up with that knight getting exchanged, possibly a set of knights getting exchanged, possibly even this whole set of minor pieces getting exchanged. And when that happens, really the only question is there enough left in the position to play for a win? And I hope the answer is just like a hopefully yes. With the improvements that we have in this video, just kind of following the engine lines and following the latest games and following the games where people got their best results, like in Carlsen versus Ding Liren, it looks like white has enough that white can keep pressing for a win if he plays the theory absolutely correctly. Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.